Hello everyone, Crystal of Power Femme Tarot here, and I am excited to settle in to the full installment of Tarot Incite, a Patreon exclusive video series dedicated to exploring the cards through the lens of social justice. If you haven't already done so, I strongly recommend you check out the intro video to this series, in which I sketch out some intentions for this offering, as well as detail what it means when I say that I'm inviting us to read the cards through the lens of social justice. Two things I want to quickly underscore before we jump into the Fool. And the first is that nothing I offer in this video or in the remainder of this series is holy writ. You likely have tarot teachings and intuitive downloads and connections that really work well in your practice, that you favor, that are really resonant and powerful. And I'm not here to dismantle or displace or to naysay any of that. This is all a thought exercise and a challenge for us all, myself included, to move beyond solely individual readings of these cards and to think of them as more capaciously relating to our socio-political context, and thinking about how we can read these cards in a way that is more justice-centered. I also want to emphasize that the decks don't do the work for us. When we're reading through the lens of social justice, and always, but especially when we're reading through the lens of social justice, we are bringing the interpretive brilliance. We are the interpretive powerhouses. In this series, we will be looking at different artistic renderings of decks or collections of decks as a way of honing in on different facets of a card's essence. But though there is a growing assortment of decks that lend themselves to a more politicized meaning, we're not here on this like holy grail quest to find like the best deck, the most PC deck, the most diverse or most radical deck, right? I think we should absolutely celebrate, uplift, support in the material and energetic and community building ways that we can these decks that are really just ever proliferating in a very exciting way. But I don't want to totally hand over our interpretive power to these deck creators. Again, I think these decks are wildly important, and their brilliance is not to be diminished. But I think if we get on this quest of like finding the quote-unquote best representation, we are really handing over all of our power to that individual creator. So instead, we're thinking about how can we learn various things from different interpretations visually of a card, and how can we apply that to whatever our home deck might be. All right, that said, let us think about the Fool. All right, the Fool is the only card in the deck, as you likely know, that is numbered 0. And as such, it is at once the start of the tarot, it is outside of the tarot, and it is the entirety of the tarot. It is the container of the tarot. A lot of interpreters, and I favor this thinking as well, interpret the sack that the Fool has as being the container of the collective unconscious, that all of the symbols and archetypes that the Fool may encounter, that we may encounter through the remainder of the deck, reside in that card, in that little pouch. I really like that because that really emphasizes for us that the Fool is already complete in and of itself, right? Sometimes when we get attached to the Fool as being this starter energy, as a beginning, we impose this idea that the Fool needs to go somewhere or is this immature fella that needs to undergo this process of self-actualization, when for me, really the Fool is the spirit and the universal impulse of becoming, not of progress, and we'll talk about that more in a moment, but of becoming, of perpetual unfurling. The Fool then isn't a card that is so much, in my mind, an archetype. It's not so much representative of you or me or a querent, right, of any figure. It is the essence of possibility, of potential, of becoming. It is that energy of the perpetual unfolding. The Fool is the card that initiates or inaugurates what many interpreters have called the Fool's Journey. And this is a fun way to get to know this card, though I invite us to trouble it as well. And in this narrative, the Fool, who represents, in this more traditional vein of thought, the querent, you, me, right, the seeker, and they travel from one major arcana card to the next in this fairly chronological linear fashion, and obtains a lesson or a key or an insight from each and stows it away in that little bag. And then it reaches the end, the world, card 21, and that represents the Fool's mastery, the Fool's self-actualization, that a major phase or life chapter has been completed. In some ways, I do think that this is kind of a cute idea, but again, this emphasizes for me that the Fool is an individual rather than this more collective spirit of becoming. But more concerning to me is that if we're not careful, we can accidentally ascribe really normative notions of time, of the life course, onto ourselves and onto the people we may be reading for. So this Fool's Journey that I just detailed operates in a more linear, chronological, lockstep fashion. It is, of course, not uncommon for us in the New Age spiritual tarot community to push back against that linear notion of time, right? We might work with phases of the moon. We might work with the wheel of the year or with seasons. We might enjoy the teachings of teachers like Lindsay Mack, who talk about life and the tarot as being spiralic, as operating in a spiral. So there's already precedent in our communities for pushing back against this linear notion of time, using the logic that nature doesn't work that way and we're not divorced from nature, and that our world imposes this very forward thinking, this progress narrative, this linear structure upon us. To that, I want to layer on a politicized meaning. Some of us who exist on the margins are accused of having what we might call Peter Pan syndrome, of never growing up. And that's not necessarily because we're immature, although maybe we are immature, and that's okay too. But it's not so much because we're immature, but rather because our life trajectory does not conform to normative notions of, say, sexuality, of kinship structures, of relationships to capitalism, to labor, to work. So think of this song, and I bet you know the lyrics too. Becky and Chad sitting in a tree. Kissing. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes the baby and the baby carriage, right? So if you were able to sing along with me, you not only have memorized a schoolyard chant, but you're also keenly aware of the normative sexual scripts that are imposed upon us, that we are groomed to inhabit. And if you don't fall in lockstep with these very linear notions of what it means to be an adult, right? Get married, have a monogamous relationship, have kids, right? Have the steady 9 to 5. You're seen as kind of existing outside of the realm of adulthood. And so I want us to kind of push back against our impulse to read the Fool as being like the start of a new journey, which it is, but I want us to be careful in how we discuss that so that we're not accidentally imposing this very like linear script onto ourselves or others, because when we do that, we're not only kind of thinking against the way like we know in the natural world time operates, but we might accidentally also be imposing upon ourselves really normative notions of development, of adulthood, of relationships to labor, of family structures, right? So all those things are sort of like sedimented into our like cultural understandings of like development, of progress, of linear time. So the Fool, because it's card 0, because it is the infinite, it is the spirit of possibility, of always becoming, right, is a really radical alternative, right, existing outside of that space of linear normative straight time. So if you're sort of like a nerd like me and you are curious to read more about like these different like conceptualizations of time, you might look into like queer time, crypt time, but in short, we're thinking about how this linear chronological time that's been imposed upon us also imposes in some subtle and not so subtle ways some very rigid understandings of sexuality, of kinship structure, of what it means to quote unquote grow up. We can see that coming through a little bit in this representation of the Fool from the Wild Unknown. And I do really love the sweetness and the vulnerability of this card. I love the Wild Unknown. It's one of my favorite decks. And I want to remind us again that the Fool is already complete. It's in fact the most complete card in the whole deck. It contains the whole deck within it, right? It is the spirit of becoming, of possibility, right? So this image of the Fool as a little chick is definitely a sweet one, a tender one that I appreciate, but there is implicit in this visual metaphor that this little chick has to grow up, that it's really not an option, that it is an imperative. And those are my little chickens in the back, my bad dog's barking, right? So as much as I do love this image, right, there is this insistence that this chick needs to develop, it needs to grow up, right? When the Fool, as I've been emphasizing, is already perfect and whole and complete and completed. It's a totally appropriate energy to embody, to occupy. It isn't necessarily an indication that you are incomplete or need to grow up, right? Another one that we might emphasize in that vein is the Fool from Next World Tarot. And I appreciate this representation too, because we have a very stationary Fool. Lots of other representations like the Fool from the Wild Unknown, this little chick is stepping off of the branch. We have the Rider-Waite-Smith, the Fool getting ready to kind of trust fall. Even the fledgling from the Slow Hauler Tarot, which we'll talk about in a minute, right? Clearly walking on a journey, right? We have a Fool in Next World that is stationary, right? And I like that representation because there's a certain patience in this card, and also a willingness to sort of like anchor and just be present in this energy rather than trying to flee out of it, to kind of embark upon this journey or this progress narrative. All right. And it says nowhere, right? So you can exist everywhere and nowhere all at one time. It's kind of a card about like existing outside in this liminal space, right? Outside of space and time. Okay, I do want to look, as I sort of teased a moment ago, this card from the Slow Hauler, which renames the Fool the Fledgling. And I absolutely love that because it does strip away some of the ways that thinking about foolishness and naivety gets unintentionally mapped onto the card, childlikeness or youthfulness in a pejorative way. It kind of strips those things away by renaming it the fledgling. And for me, that really embodies this idea of perpetual becoming. And we see that in its visual metaphor as well. So the figure of the fledgling is ghost-like. It seems like they are just really in the process of taking form, which is such a beautiful way of representing everything that we have been discussing. And for me, it's a reminder that all of us, individually and collectively, are always, always, always in a process of becoming. Right? You can see like through the backpack, this sort of ghostly specter figure, always in this process of becoming. Another thing I want to mention about the Fool, which we'll go back to the Rider-Waite to think through this, is that we often associate it with this idea of radical trust, or like hashtag let go, let God, the universe has your back, which I'm generally pretty down for. But when things like that, like those sorts of phrases, become sort of cliche, which isn't to say that they can't be true and very real, but when they become sort of canonized in tarot theory, it means that we kind of can be tempted to stop questioning them, right? So they can be very powerful and they can be true, but we maybe lose our like critical edge when we're applying those meanings because they become so rote, they become so canonized, so naturalized. This idea of the trust fall can kind of obscure the fact that for some of us, there's a safety net that exists right about here, right? So some of us, like taking a big leap, literally, metaphorically, is going to be less scary, less risky than for other folks, right? So if you're someone who has a supportive family of economic means, especially if you have a safety net in the form of savings, if you have a safety net in the form of like stable housing, where you're not thinking about where your food comes from, right? Kind of taking big risks isn't quite as scary as it could be, right? So this is more so just a little note for when we're interpreting the card as being about like trusting in the universe, trusting in the divine, to know that some of us, it's not that some of us can't do that or shouldn't do that or are unable to do that, but that due to privilege, right, some of us have more capacity to do that, while other folks have that capacity tempered or curtailed a bit by the material conditions of their lives, by like really real things about like survival and making ends meet. So just for when we're interpreting for ourselves and other people, if we really want to say like the universe has your back, yes, that's very true, but let's leave a little bit of space for the ways that that's much more challenging for some of us to do than others, and that even if we feel strongly called by spirit, some of us still need to figure out like how we're going to pay our bills, right? Okay. Going back to this card, the fledgling, with this idea of radical becoming, I'm taking us further away from this idea that the Fool is an archetype or represents us or the querent, right? And anchoring us into this idea that this card represents endless becoming, or what we might call or hear referred to as expansion, evolution, potential, possibility, right? This spirit of unfurling, this spirit of expansion, this impulse to evolve individually, collectively, this is precisely what oppressive forces seek to squash, right? Oppressive forces seek to squash anything that is life affirming, anything that brings optimism, that brings hope, that brings with it a sense that things can be different, that seeks to squash anything about how we can imagine the world otherwise, right? And so in this way, the Fool really is not just about our individual, spiritual, personal development. It's really about this collective impulse to imagine the world otherwise, to imagine it differently, which is a really beautiful message that I've been leaning into as I journey with this card this year. This is my card of the year, and sometimes I can get really myopic, like all of us, and try to think about like, what is the lesson for me? What about me and my personal development? And when really this card can connect us to this collective impulse to hold on to joy, to trust that there's always a continual unfurling, right? And sometimes we have to continually fight for that unfurling, but that this process of becoming is our birthright. And this connects us to the last representation that I want to underscore, and this comes from our tarot. And I love that it represents Joan of Arc as our Fool. And I encourage you to do a little bit of research about Joan of Arc, but I can just really briefly kind of retell her story here, and specifically its relationship to the Fool card, of course. I love Joan of Arc as the Fool because it does hold on to the power and potential and insight of youth. So whereas in some ways it wasn't really working for me in the Wild Unknown, I do kind of like it in the Joan of Arc card, because it talks about the power of youth. And Joan of Arc passed away, was killed before she even matured into adulthood. So her entire powerful story is within the confines of childhood. So for me, that's really powerful as a way of like honoring the potential and the wisdom of youth, rather than this impulse to like progress out of it. Joan of Arc, as the narrative of her life goes, at a young age began to hear voices. And I think that there's absolutely space for not only a deeply spiritual, but for a crip reading or a mad reading of Joan of Arc's story, and thinking about like neurodiversity and things like that. But she began to hear voices, and she understood them to be the voices of saints. And they were compelling her to help lead the country of France in a resistance to English rule. And at 16, she followed the direction of the voices of these saints and became the youngest, even to this day, the youngest person to lead a military force. And after she helped to lead France in its resistance against the English, she claims she stopped hearing these voices. So I love this because she was receiving divine directive, right? And this reminds us of the way that the Fool is a profoundly spiritual card, right? One of, as we were talking about, radical trust, whatever that might mean within your own spiritual paradigm, right? But what I dig most about Joan of Arc as being the Fool in our tarot is that the spiritual guidance, the divine directive that she was getting was not just about her sole individual life purpose. It wasn't just about this is what you have to do, right? It's about this is what we need you to do in service of your people, right? So her life purpose was connected to this larger collective goal. So I don't want to overly romanticize her or her story. I'm certainly not an expert in Joan of Arc, but the bit that I know and what I was able to read in the guidebook, it really struck me that this is a pretty clever choice for the Fool. And what resonated most for me is the fact that Joan of Arc, even if she lies outside my own spiritual tradition and might lie outside of yours, is that her divine downloads, the way that she was practicing radical trust, right, wasn't just about her own individual spiritual development, her own individual personal development, but was really about how she was being guided to work with and be in service of a collective mission. Right? All right, folks, that is our exploration of the Fool through the lens of social justice. I do hope you enjoyed. Again, this I hope fuels, inaugurates, kickstarts conversation. It's not the be-all, end-all, and I am excited to learn so much from you all. So if you have an interpretation of the Fool that you think aligns with a justice-centered approach to tarot, please do share it in the comments below, and I look forward to our conversation. Bye, folks.